There is a mythic dimension of reality that permeates history throughout time. The narrative thread of the collective psyche weaves itself into memory, both personal and archival. It is a dimension alive in the direct experience of consciousness and takes shape in the stories that we tell each other and ourselves. Within its realm are certain historical moments that seem more deeply saturated with meaning than others. Moments in which the mythic dimension crosses over to become history itself. These are the junctures that pivot the direction of humanity, changing something fundamental in the outer world, as well as something intrinsic about our humanness. The discovery of the planet Pluto was one such moment. Pluto roared into existence in 1930, in between the world wars and at the height of the Great Depression. Its discovery was hailed as the scientific achievement of the century. The ninth planet cracked open the universe, and with its name selection, brought with it the myth of the underworld, where the mythic Pluto reigned. Suddenly, the collective psyche was forced to shift, to make room not only for a larger solar system, but also for the re-emergence of the death god into conscious awareness. These enormous changes foreshadowed an even deeper transformation of humanity's relationship to mass death and evil. The cultural synchronicities between the discovery of Pluto, with all the weight of its mythology, and the development of nuclear fission and eventual dropping of the atom bombs would get recorded within the same breath of history. Pluto would prove an accurate augur for what was to follow, and the world would be changed forever. However, Pluto's significance extends beyond the effect of its astronomical appearance and the events that followed. From its discovery to its recent diminution to dwarf planet status, Pluto has mesmerized and challenged all areas of thought, from the scientific to the symbolic. Drawing from its mythic origins, Pluto has come to be known as a metaphor for deep realms of the unconscious, dimensions that, although frightening, yield great and meaningful treasure. We feel the influence of this planet and its mythology endure to this day. Although the forms may be different, great changes that occur within the collective unconscious inherit Pluto's legacy. We are once again in a historical moment of tremendous transformation, with dire consequences looming. The way forward may lie somewhere in Pluto's story. Darkness and wisdom leading back to one another. I'm LD Deutsch. You're listening to Pluto and the Mythic Dimension, an audio rendition of an essay I wrote for Sacred Bones Books in 2019. Pluto's discovery is bound tightly to the histories of Uranus and Neptune. In March of 1781, while searching the sky for double stars, the astronomer William Herschel came across a celestial object that he first thought was a comet. He had actually stumbled upon Uranus, the first planet found with the aid of a telescope. The fact that an instrument of emerging technology was used in the planet's discovery is fitting, because Uranus was found during the peak of the Enlightenment. The accidental discovery would break open the boundaries of what was thought possible and change the shape of outer space forever. It did not initially occur to Herschel that what he saw could be a planet. At that time, there was much public bias against the notion. Up until then, all the known planets could be seen with the naked eye, and there was much cultural and religious significance assigned to a solar system that stopped at Saturn. In fact, other astronomers had noted Uranus before Herschel, but it had always been classified as a star. Herschel was the first to notice that it was moving, unlike a star, and not in the erratic way that comets tended to move. This object moved in an orderly path that was almost circular. It had to be a planet. However, there were certain peculiarities in Uranus's apparent orbit. The path of the newly discovered body did not seem to adhere entirely to Newtonian laws of gravity with relation to its path around the Sun. After exhausting other possibilities, the only explanation deemed plausible was that there was another, larger celestial object somewhere beyond Uranus whose gravity was pulling at Uranus and affecting its trajectory. This intimation sparked a great astronomical investigation, which eventually led to the discovery of Neptune by Johann Gottfried Galle in September 1846. Although the gravity from Neptune did account for some of Uranus's abnormalities, it didn't explain all of them. Furthermore, Neptune appeared to have some orbital eccentricities of its own. And so there was hypothesized yet another planet, one even larger than Neptune, somewhere beyond them both, whose gravity disturbed the paths of both Uranus and Neptune. This hypothesized planet soon became known as Planet X, and thus the search for Pluto was born. The case for Planet X was championed by Percival Lowell, a wealthy American who founded the famous Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona. It's worth noting that the first part of Lowell's astronomical career was devoted to his fanatical belief that there were alien-made canals on Mars. Later, the images that so convinced him of this were shown to be optical illusions, created by certain cratered patterns on the surface of the red planet. However, his lasting legacy would develop from his ardent search for the object that could cause such disturbance to Uranus and Neptune, the devotion to which took up the last 10 years of his life. Lowell searched for Planet X from 1906 until his death in 1916. When he died in 1916, an astronomer named Clyde Tombaugh took over the mission. Using Lowell's calculations as a guide, Tombaugh searched the proposed areas of space using a blink comparator, which is an astronomical tool that allows comparison between two different photographs of the same area of sky taken at two different times. Then, around 4:00 p.m. on February 18, 1930, while examining the area surrounding Delta Geminorum, the eighth brightest star in the constellation of Gemini, Tombaugh spotted what would become the last planet to be discovered in our solar system. When it came to naming this new member of the planetary neighborhood, there were a few initial options proposed. Planet X was suggested as a permanent choice, as was Lowell. Janus, the double-faced god of new beginnings, was also proposed, with the reasoning being that his two faces represented where humanity now stood in relation to the cosmos, one face looking back towards our sun, and the other looking outward toward the vast eternity of outer space. Minerva was the strongest original contender, as the name was seen as a way of bringing the absent feminine into the solar system. Although Minerva ultimately did not make the cut, the naming process would not go without feminine influence. The honor eventually fell to an 11-year-old girl from Oxford, England, named Venetia Burney. Venetia had been studying mythology in school and suggested to her well-connected grandfather that the new planet be named Pluto in order to keep with the mythological theme of the others. Her grandfather, a retired librarian from Oxford University, was able to telegraph Lowell Observatory proposing his granddaughter's recommendation. The name Pluto was announced on May 1st, 1930, the first two letters providing a lovely, accidental homage to Percival Lowell. It's fitting that a young girl would be the vehicle through which Pluto received its name, as it is a young woman who features as the star of what is arguably the most Plutonic myth of all, that of Persephone. Although Venetia Burney certainly knew of Pluto's mythology and that he was the god of death, it remained to be seen just how appropriate her suggestion would end up being. The psychologist James Hillman presents the argument that archetypal material in some way determines its own expressive terms as an aspect of its self-definition. He explains that the metaphors chosen for describing archetypal concepts and systems are in fact intrinsic parts of those concepts and systems themselves. Taking this into consideration, naming something becomes a real act and is not just a nominalistic venture. The name takes us into reality. In the case of Pluto, it is a reality of unimaginable depth, initiation, and resurrection. Pluto is the Latinized name for the Greek god Hades, lord of the underworld. Hades was the brother of Zeus and Poseidon. All were the sons of the Titans Kronos and Rhea. After the three younger gods overthrew their parents in the War of the Titans, they divided between themselves all things in existence. Zeus became the ruler of the skies, Poseidon of the seas, and Hades of the invisible underworld. The word Hades translates into the unseen one. As a god, he was associated with formlessness, invisibility, and shadows, and was the only deity without a dedicated shrine. He was infrequently portrayed in art or pottery, and his face is regularly obscured in the images of him that do exist. Often it is the presence of his three-headed dog Cerberus that hints that the godlike figure in whatever image is in fact Hades. Because his depiction was such an uncommon occurrence, there is no lasting consensus to what he looked like. His personality also remains somewhat indefinable and can only be pieced together through the aftermath of his effect on the other mythological characters with whom he comes in contact. His reputation was one of sternness, with the occasional act of altruism. Although he was unpitying, his appearance and function in a myth often involved establishing or maintaining some kind of balance. Hades' character and appearance remain so elusive because the ancient Greeks feared him greatly. They tried not to think of him too much, lest they might draw his attention, and it is for this reason that we have so few artistic representations of him. The fear of his overwhelming power also prevented the ancient Greeks from using the name Hades directly, except when absolutely necessary. Instead, they referred to him through euphemisms. Around the 5th century BCE, the god known as Hades started to be referred to as Pluto, the nominal change possibly taking such firm hold because of the fear surrounding the utterance of his original name. The root of Pluto translates into riches, or wealth, or wealthy, and here an interesting quality is born into this underworldly figure. Now a god who had been primarily identified with the fearful aspects of invisibility also becomes associated with nourishment and gift-giving. We are reminded that Hades is the term for both the god and the realm over which he presides, and that this realm is the underworld. In other words, it is the inner world, here referencing inner earth, that which is under the surface on which mortals dwell. As so, it is also the realm of all that earth provides, and later, as we shall see, also metaphoric of the inner world of man and his psyche. It is from this realm that all gifts emerge. Through all the nebulosity of Hades' character, there is one myth in which his desires are featured heavily. In it, we are provided some understanding of his nature and the nature of the realm that bears his name, which are often inextricable. It is the myth of Persephone, of her descent to and rise from the underworld. Through her interactions with the god, and through the symbolism of the narrative at large, we are able to glimpse enough of Hades' shadow to intimate the sinewy laws of his domain. The myth begins with Persephone and a party of other goddesses picking wildflowers in a field. Hades saw the group from afar and fell madly in love with Persephone at first sight. He approached Persephone's father, who happened to be his brother Zeus, and asked him for her hand in marriage. Wishing not to offend his brother, but knowing well that Persephone's mother Demeter, goddess of Earth's fertility, would never approve of the marriage, Zeus neither gave nor denied his consent. Hades interpreted this gesture as Zeus not saying no, and so, emboldened by his brother's implied compliance, set out to abduct the virginal goddess. While in the field, Persephone came upon a narcissus flower with 100 heads. Some say the flower was placed there as a favor to Zeus by Gaia, an earth goddess ancestress of Demeter. The flower, which was unlike any Persephone had ever seen, mesmerized the young maiden, and she plucked it. Suddenly, from the place where the flower had stood in the earth, a great chasm ripped open, and there appeared a portal into the underworld. From it, Hades emerged in his chariot and dragged a screaming Persephone down into his realm to be his queen. Back on Earth, Demeter couldn't find Persephone. When the Earth goddess soon realized that her daughter was truly missing, she became consumed with grief and began to search the world over for her. Being that Demeter was the goddess of fertility, all living things on the planet ceased to grow in her despair. Earth entered a perpetual winter, becoming barren and unyielding. After enduring a challenging saga of her own, Demeter came to learn of Persephone's location from Helios, the all-seeing sun god, who admitted that he had seen Hades take her. Demeter was furious, but instead of going to Olympus to confront Zeus directly, whom she had also discovered was involved, she continued to roam the earth despondently until all life teetered on the verge of extinction. Fearing for all of humanity, Zeus tried begging Demeter to return to Olympus, but she refused. So, resigning himself to the only option remaining, Zeus sent Hermes down into Hades in order to retrieve Persephone and return her to her mother, on the one condition that she had not yet tasted the food of the dead. If Persephone had tasted such food, she would have to remain below. Demeter was overjoyed by the decision, and Hades dismayed. The lord of the underworld relayed the information to Persephone, who, euphoric, began to climb into Hermes' chariot to be transported to the surface. Just then, a gardener from one of Hades' fruit fields announced that he had seen Persephone eat 6 seeds of a pomegranate from a tree in the orchard. Persephone was still taken to meet her mother, but upon reaching the surface, the truth of the pomegranate was revealed. When Demeter heard of this, she became hysterical again and refused to remove her infertile curse. Without the curse lifted, all of mankind would perish, and so Zeus quickly came to resolve the matter. A compromise was reached. Persephone would live 6 months on the surface in the company of her mother, and 6 months in Hades with her husband, where she would rule as queen of the underworld. The earth would have 6 months of beauty, growth, spring, and harvest, and 6 months of degeneration, death, and winter. There are many things to be said about this myth. Psychologically, Persephone's tale is often interpreted as one of initiation, of having naivete ripped away and venturing through depth territory, of becoming involved in something inherently overwhelming, but something that eventually leads back to wholeness. Persephone falls through an unknown crack in the known system into a realm she could have never imagined. However, she soon becomes queen of the very realm into which she was reluctantly dragged. In fact, in her role as queen, she acquires the reputation of being merciful and gracious. It is only through her knowledge of the underworld and the integration of that knowledge into herself that she gains her own personal power and the power of mercy. She is the only Greek mythological character allowed to live in both the upper and lower worlds, the upper and lower dimensions of reality. Thus, she becomes the ultimate image of a unified whole, although the unification was entered into through suffering. In terms of understanding the symbolism of Pluto, one of the most important parts of this myth may be Persephone's descent. Through the act of picking a flower that was placed there for her to pick, Persephone encounters an involuntary trauma. But the pre-existence of the flower also implies that she is somehow destined to lose her innocence this way. She's taken to the underworld by a god whose presence is inherent in the flower itself, but hidden from her viewpoint. She is unconscious of the depths and unaware of how close she stands to them. Yet this is her fate. She must marry Pluto. She must become deeply acquainted with the depths. she cannot remain ignorant of them. Through this myth, the depths announce that they are part of nature and that they will be known. Pluto's appearance in the myth of Persephone was as forceful as the appearance of his namesake planet into the material realm, and each required a complete transformation of consciousness. The celestial object and mythological god both reigned in realms of utter darkness, one at nearly 4 billion miles away from the sun, and the other in the literal underworld. When the decision to give Pluto its name was made, it could not have yet been known that mankind itself would soon go through its own Plutonic initiation. The world was between the First and Second World Wars, and humanity was passing through a portal in which what was deemed possible was changing drastically. A chasm was opening. A hidden presence, much like the one lying in wait in the Narcissus, was surrounding history at that moment, threatening the very material of reality itself. Pluto was discovered and named in 1930. The neutron was discovered in 1932. Also in 1932, an experiment was done that showed by bombarding atoms with accelerated protons, a nuclear transformation could be induced. In 1935, it was discovered that this process produced a greater variety of results when neutrons were used in the place of protons. Then, in December 1938, while experimenting with bombarding an assortment of different elements with neutrons, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann discovered what would become nuclear fission and unleashed atomic energy for the first time. While most of the elements tested were transformed only a little by being bombarded with neutrons, it was discovered that uranium nuclei changed enormously and divided into 2 approximately equal parts. Found among the uranium's debris was radioactive barium, which has an atomic number of 56. The barium weighed less than the original uranium nucleus, which has an atomic number of 92. This became the first experiment to confirm Einstein's theory of equivalence between mass and energy, E equals mc squared. The process was named fission after the biological term for cell division. Further experiments showed that not only did this fission cause an initial release of enormous amounts of energy, but also caused the release of other neutrons, which could possibly collide with other atoms and potentially cause a self-sustaining chain reaction of ever-increasing amounts of energy. In 1941, while at UC Berkeley, Glenn T. Seaborg and a team of physicists experimented with bombarding uranium in a cyclotron. A cyclotron is a particle accelerator that uses an alternating electric field that follows a magnetic field in the shape of a spiral. When uranium was bombarded in such a way, it produced neptunium, an element with an atomic number of 93. Although neptunium was initially discovered in 1939, the experiments done at Berkeley showed that in the cyclotron, the neptunium subsequently began to decay, revealing an entirely new element. With 94 protons in its nucleus, this element was heavier than any that had been encountered before. When deciding what to name this newly found element, Seaborg and his team followed history's example. The planet Uranus was discovered at the end of the 18th century, Neptune in the 19th century, and Pluto in the 20th. Uranium was found in 1781, 8 years after the discovery of Uranus. Choosing the name uranium was an easy decision at the time, as both discoveries epitomized the spirit that defined the Enlightenment. No new elements were found until the atomic experiments that started in the 1930s yielded neptunium in 1939. When it came to naming neptunium, science looked back to the last time an element was named and followed suit. So, when it came to the heavy thing found in December 1940, Seaborg almost had no choice but to call it plutonium. It is a strange synchronicity that both uranium and plutonium were found so close to the discovery of their namesake planets, and that it was these two elements that would be used in the atomic bombs. It was as if the elements in the planets were two ends of the same pole. Plutonium was the active ingredient in the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. Uranium was the active ingredient in the bomb dropped on Hiroshima 3 days prior. The death toll of the combined bombings would exceed upwards of 226,000 people. About half of the deaths in each city happened on the first day. The rest were from acute effects of radiation. Although uranium played a crucial part in the creation of the bomb, it was Pluto's arrival as a planet, symbol, myth, and element that seemed to herald the events that were dawning. Furthermore, uranium occurs naturally, whereas plutonium only exists because of the interference of man. Reactor-grade plutonium will spontaneously ignite when exposed to air. Because of this, plutonium must be surrounded by nitrogen at all times. It is so dangerous that its toxic dose is measured in millionths of a gram. Through the nuclear experiments done at this time, mankind came into contact with an energy force that had never made it into the material plane before, a force that really had only ever existed in the imagination. It is as though, through harnessing atomic energy, humanity had done something so unprecedented that we spontaneously encountered, or co-created, the collective mythic counterpart of such energy. If such a power had made it to the realm of matter, the myth needed to as well. We met a new god in the form that they take in the modern world, a planet. After the results of these experiments, there could be no claims of absolute knowledge anymore. The very unit of matter was broken apart. Modernity had rendered reality obsolete, and what was left was a groundlessness, a formlessness, a limitless repeating chain of reaction. If the atom, the unit of life, falls under Zeus's domain, then the splitting of it would invite Hades to the table. Up until the late 1970s, Pluto held fast to its position as the ninth planet, although astronomical advancements had revealed its shrinking size. Throughout its lifetime as a planet, Pluto would go from being hypothetically bigger than Jupiter to, in reality, being smaller than Earth's moon. Although a few prophetically minded astronomical thinkers had already begun to portend Pluto's fate, it wasn't until the Voyager missions of 1977 that things really started to shift. As the Voyager missions started to send back detailed images of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, and the celestial objects that surround them, we began to see a more complicated and diverse picture. The new information from these images seemed to spark a deeper interest in proper definition of what exactly made up our planetary neighborhood. Suddenly, Pluto's description was fitting better in with groups of asteroids and comets, rather than with the other planets in the solar system. In 1978, Pluto's moon Charon was found. Named after the psychopomp who ferried souls across the river Styx, Charon the moon turned out to be nearly the size of Pluto itself. The two were discovered to be in a tidal lock, meaning that they always show the same face to each other. Already feeling the changing definitional tides, many Pluto enthusiasts looked to the existence of Charon as categorical evidence of planethood. The argument was that only planets have moons, But unfortunately, when the asteroid Ida was discovered with its moon Dactyl in 1994, this argument would have to be given up. By the 1980s, our understanding of the entire solar system was changing. As technology progressed and astronomical instruments became more refined, we began to reclassify the existing planets even further. Mars, Earth, Venus, and Mercury became known as terrestrial planets because they are dense, rocky, and small. Neptune, Uranus, Saturn, and Jupiter became classified as Jovian planets because they are gaseous, large, and ringed. As the other planets began to reveal their specific natures, it only served to highlight how different Pluto truly was. Then, in 1992, astronomers Jane Liu and David Jewett discovered the first object of the Kuiper Belt that was neither Pluto nor Charon. The Kuiper Belt was the name given to the vast icy region of the solar system beyond Neptune that is home to Pluto and would reveal itself to be host to many other icy celestial bodies as well. Although this first object, known as 1992 QB1, was not similar enough to Pluto to be a threat to its definition, the astronomers soon found objects that did share some of Pluto's traits, such as an elongated orbit. Liu, Jewett, and others would go on to find celestial objects of similar size and mass to Pluto. Then, in 2005, a team of astronomers from Caltech, led by Mike Brown, discovered Eris, a trans-Neptunian celestial body with a larger mass than Pluto. From then on, all bets were off. In January 2006, NASA's New Horizons launched on its mission to image Pluto and other members of the Kuiper Belt. The grand piano-sized spacecraft was the fastest man-made object to ever leave Earth. It passed through the Jupiter system in February and March of 2007, which provided it with a gravity assist before arriving on the path that would take it to Pluto in 2015. On board the craft was an ounce of Clyde Tombaugh's ashes and a dust counter named after Venetia Burney. The mission of New Horizons was not only to image Pluto and its moons, but also to better understand the Kuiper Belt objects that lay beyond. Also in 2006, the International Astronomical Union met in Prague to discuss, among other topics, what to do with Pluto's planetary classification. At first, the IAU considered expanding the solar system to 12 planets that would include Pluto and Charon as twin planets. That proposal was rejected. Instead, the IAU decided to redefine a planet to mean a spherical celestial object that orbits the sun and clears the environment around its orbit by the sheer force of its own gravity. It was this last classification criteria that sealed Pluto's diminutive fate. Because Pluto does not have sufficient mass to influence the other Kuiper Belt objects, it would be henceforth known as a dwarf planet in a swarm of other-like bodies. The whole world seemed up in arms about the decision, and there was great controversy around the resolution reached. Some due to the fact that only 1/10 of the members of the IAU were actually present for the deciding vote. The timing was also incredibly conspicuous. Debates about Pluto's planethood had long been underway, but the IAU waited until after New Horizons had just launched to make their formal decision. Many felt that this was an in-community slap in the face to Plutophiles. But for whatever the reason or consequence, Pluto went from being the smallest of the planets to the largest of the Kuiper Belt objects. There are many symbolic ways to read Pluto's turbulent history. The guardian who stood between our solar system and the rest of the universe had been removed from its post. If we follow the connection between the planets and the gods with whom they share names, the psychological reality becomes apparent. How are we to think about the energies that move us, that orbit around us? How do we think about the forces that affect our lives in large but invisible ways? What happens to our collective relationship to the corresponding energy or mytheme if the society we live in demotes a planet? Changes to the astronomical canon are of such magnitude that they force rearrangement of the collective unconscious. Such processes can also reveal our relationship to the unconscious in general. This is especially potent in the case of Pluto, where both the planet's history and the death god's mythology can be seen as analogous to the workings of the inner world of man. There is no time in the underworld, just as there is no time in the unconscious. The unconscious is to non-consciousness, as the underworld is to non-existence. But there are moments of activity that sometimes burst forth into conscious dimensions of reality. We can see the existence of the unconscious much like an orbital effect, similar to the originally proposed influence of Pluto on Neptune and Uranus. Although we cannot know the unconscious directly, we become aware of its existence because of its influence on other more conscious aspects of psyche. And similar to how Pluto proved to be a cluster of entities instead of one large monstrous one, our relationship to the unconscious shifts from form to fleeting form, from coagulation to dispersion, through relativization. This analogy may be taken one step further into the personal, if the sun may be considered a proper symbol for the ego. In the same way that our understanding of Pluto went from being one large body to a collection of smaller ones, so the personal aspect of consciousness may intimate larger unconscious forces by their field effect, however slippery or shape-shifting they may be. We are reminded here that the unconscious process may also end up being entirely different than what the conscious psyche perceives it to be. The original hypothesis that fueled Percival Lowell's search was that there was a planet beyond Uranus and Neptune that was large enough to affect the orbits of both. This turned out to be false. As more sophisticated instruments yielded better information about Uranus and Neptune, the apparent abnormalities of their orbits turned out to be misidentified. And like this proposed planetary influence, so too is the mythological Hades seen most clearly through his effect on other Greek mythological characters. The dragging down into depth is inescapably destructive to the ego. The ego cannot understand why this is occurring at the time of the event. We see this in Persephone. However, Hades is also known as a bringer of balance. Something in the myth is hinting that humanity is being initiated, but at the end of the initiation, there is wholeness. The unconscious may be seen as an obscure cluster of itself, a thing holding together. If Pluto can stand for a moment as its shadowy ambassador, then the coming into consciousness, distortion, and recession of its namesake planet aligns very well with its own nature. Astrologers have long suggested that the historical period in which a planet is discovered is relevant to that planet's archetypal meaning. The supporting argument for this theory is that the discovery of the physical planet brings the planet's archetype into the conscious aspect of the collective psyche. The corresponding meaning thus becomes emergent, and the planets act as emissaries. Pluto's astrological symbolism echoes both the Persephone myth and the myth-like reality of the bomb. In astrology, Pluto represents the piercing of reality's veil. It is the planet of disruptive energies, which lift a subject into an entirely new realm, whether they like it or not. All three trans-Saturnian planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, represent the dispersion of matter into energy. However, where Uranus stands for lightning-like radical changes and Neptune for dissolving boundaries into filmy nothingness, Pluto stands for the sudden, sometimes violent, confrontation man must have with soul in the face of the depths. Pluto is the end and the beginning, initiation and regeneration, transformation and transfiguration. Some key words for Pluto's role in astrology are transition, intensification, obsession, miracles, rejuvenation, destruction, lawlessness, and annihilation. Pluto is the outermost planet and thus moves the slowest. Because of this, it is a generational planet, one of group involvement and evolution at large. It is considered the planetary representative of mass movements, extreme destruction, and anything fantastical in nature. In the birth chart, Pluto points to where the native will search for ultimate truth and meaning, where the curse and the blessing lie side by side. The area of life highlighted by Pluto may be subject to upheaval and extremes, but will also yield the deepest meaning. In this way, Pluto is the ultimate equalizer, which is a reference back to Hades' hidden role as a balancer. During the times when Pluto transits other planets or points in the natal chart, the subject will find themselves peeling off layer after layer of truth. These transits often indicate a turning point, one that is commonly accompanied by crisis. One must earn their way through Pluto's test. It cannot be faked. The glyph for Pluto is a cross with a semicircle at the top, and above that, a circle slightly unattached. The cross stands for materiality, the semicircle for receptivity, and the circle for potentiality. Much like the mythology of Hades, the planet Pluto stands for what is hidden, underground, secret, and unconscious. Pluto rules cemeteries, decay, caves, and fermentation. His association with fermentation is an interesting side note. Heraclitus considered Pluto and Dionysus to be the same figure. According to him, Dionysus descends into Hades and rises again twice born, much like Persephone, but here it is the masculine element represented. As Dionysus/Pluto is twice born, he accepts that death is a dimension of life. Pluto's astrological association with that which is hidden makes for an interesting relation back to the history of plutonium. The efforts and experiments done in the creation of plutonium were done in such secrecy that the research that went into it was never recorded in print. The findings were not published until after the bomb on Nagasaki was dropped. The actual dates and times of the discovery are only known thanks to a correspondence of seaborgs. Being the ruler of the underworld, Pluto is also the ruler of the inner world, of Earth itself and what lies beneath it. This is reflected in the mythological and astrological associations with riches, bounties, and gifts of the earth. Inner Earth is both volcanic and filled with water, both of which are highly symbolic of Pluto. In fact, Pluto is ruled by Scorpio, the zodiac sign of fixed water. The water in the earth does not move. It is fixed, dark, muddy, and full of mold. But mold is a life form nonetheless. This water nurtures everything on Earth's surface, whether the surface knows it or not. The ice found within the actual geological landscape of the planet is also a beautiful reference to the astrological association with fixed water. Pluto's path around the Sun is 248 years long, so its appearance in its home sign is rare and powerful. Pluto entered Scorpio in 1983 and stayed there until 1995. A planet is most comfortable in its ruling sign and is able to express itself more categorically when there. In this period, Pluto resonated deeply with the scorpionic themes of sex, death, and regeneration. During the time of Pluto's passage through Scorpio, the world saw Plutonic themes explode, such as the AIDS crisis, the beginning of globalization, the beginning of the war on drugs, the Human Genome Project, a rise in gun violence, the Gulf War, the Chernobyl disaster, the Exxon Valdez disaster, the first untethered spacewalk, and the growth of the internet, just to name a few. Those born during these years will have a more direct understanding of Plutonic themes in their lives from a collective and personal viewpoint. These natives will reach 30 years old between the years of 2014 and 2025. Interestingly enough, this timeline coincides with New Horizons' arrival at Pluto in 2015. As this group comes of age, they face a world on the verge of environmental collapse, with deeply embedded institutional corruption, the rise of artificial intelligence, and frequent technological transformation. It is this same group that has sparked an enormous increase in an interest in the occult. Pluto and Scorpio have everything to do with mystery, research, and meaning, and we are again reminded that Pluto is the planet of mass change. The current resurgence of astrology alone is often credited to this generation coming into their own. Furthermore, the recent occult renaissance may be read into the story of Pluto's astronomical declassification. As the energy of Pluto was denied its outward expression as a planet, it made its way back into the unconscious to be expressed as a mass movement towards mystery, the occult, and unseen forces. The more that energy is denied, repressed, and demoted from status, the more it will come through in bigger and bigger unconscious forms. Those born between 1980 and 1995 are also the first generation of the mass internet age, which influences them at every level. Millennials have access to information and connectivity like never before, and also a level of unprecedented exposure. It is difficult to shock them, as they are predisposed to understand how the world works in terms of unseen realities. As this generation enters adulthood and begins to take positions of societal power, it will be this mindset that influences how history will unfold. The 20th century brought the planet Pluto into existence, and the 21st saw its downfall. During the time of its arrival, the world became initiated into a reality that could not have been imagined generations prior. Humanity began to see extraordinary advancements in technology, unimaginable death, and the mysteries of matter revealed. The Plutonic aspect of consciousness burrowed its way out into the light of day, and with it came irreconcilable realities. At the time of the planet's discovery, the public's digestion of the event had Plutonic undertones as well. When Gustav Holst wrote his suite The Planets in 1916, inspired by the planets and the gods they were named after, the solar system then stopped at Neptune. After the discovery of Pluto, Holst set out to write a movement dedicated to it. Fittingly, a stroke prevented him from ever finishing it. Some have claimed that when Disney, the monolith of capitalist myth-making, named their new dog character Pluto in 1930, right after the new planet received its name, it was an unconscious attempt at distracting the world from understanding just what exactly was being brought into being. Instead of corporate America's cat-like reflexes taking advantages of the times and zeitgeist, it may have been responding to something much deeper. Many historians have recently compared the time we are living in with that of the 1930s. With the rise of public racism and xenophobia, fascism, a depression and banking crisis, and the ever-steady increase of technology permeating society and upending entire industries, the similarities are easy to see. I wondered as I began writing this essay if we would have our own Plutonic moment, our own new moment of dark discovery. If so, what would it portend this time? I believe we have been answered with the first imaging of a black hole, a near incomprehensible picture of nothingness. Might this incredible astronomical feat have something to tell us about what's happening deep in the collective consciousness? Might there be some aspect emerging that looks like a black hole? Like the 1930s, the crisis is seeping into areas beyond the political and social. It has become and is becoming deeply personal. What can we learn from these great changes humanity has already undergone? There was an awakening with Pluto, one that must be kept within the realm of light, within the realm of contour and vision. We must accept the reality that Pluto ushered in, knowing that it may ultimately be unanswerable, that darkness may penetrate a depth we have not yet seen. There are aspects of psyche and of reality that may be impossible to reconcile entirely, at least within the collective mind frame we have inherited. We may never see a stable reflection of truth because the truthful reflection is not stable. If we go back to sleep, we will lose whatever treasures may be hidden. At the end of the day, one of the treasures may be the unknown itself. Mystery is inherent in existence. Maybe it is not something we don't yet know, but that knowing itself is in some ways non-human. The bottom has no bottom. We must find balance upon groundlessness. Humility and transcendence lead back to one another. We cannot be intimidated and call it caution. We have to accept reality and let it change us. Persephone may be our greatest teacher of all in these present times. She pulls up the flower and with it all of consciousness. She learns the truth of the underworld, and through the acceptance of its realm, she becomes unified. If we are overwhelmed by what lies in darkness, be it in an inner reality or one millions of miles from the sun, it is through radical acceptance that we are freed. We must develop an understanding of what leads back to wholeness. Integration cannot take place until both dimensions of reality are acknowledged, because the depths are a part of nature. Persephone learns to live with this knowledge, and in turn becomes a merciful queen. May we follow her example as we move into whatever lies beyond the black hole. Pluto in the Mythic Dimension was written and narrated by LD Deutsch. This audio essay was produced and edited by Grace Scott. The music you've heard is from the 2019 album, An Attempt to Draw Aside the Veil by Jim Jarmusch and Jozef van Wissem, copyright Sacred Bones Records. A printed edition of Pluto in the Mythic Dimension and other writing by LD Deutsch can be purchased from Sacred Bones at sacredbonesrecords.com.